The soul is a veritable prisoner, bound within his body, and that instead of investigating reality by itself and in itself, it is compelled to peer through the bars of its prison. Plato, Greek philosopher. Good morning, everybody, or should I say late afternoon. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. Let me carefully walk away from this spot because just before I recorded this video, I fell inside of this pond. These rocks are very slippery when wet. This is Overland Falls in the lower part of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, and today we're going to talk about Greek history. Finally, I've got plenty of notes for you guys, but before, I want to mention what Shenandoah is all about. So this is, it's on the Blue Ridge mountain chain. It's got, most of the park is a highway type of road, or like a road with 35 mile per hour speed limit. It's 101 miles and it rides across the top of the Blue Chain Mountains, or Blue Ridge Mountains, a chain of them that are in the Appalachians. And there's also over 500 miles of individual trails. I want to say five separate mountain tops in particular. The tallest one's around 5,000 feet. And lots of families, but check this out. Like there's this, I have a few other waterfall spots that I visited today that I will definitely be sure to upload some pictures of to my Instagram so you can check those out. And now I'm trying to get up to the top here without falling down while also holding all my stuff. So wish me luck. Oh, now, if you guys remember, the last time we spoke about Greek history, we were getting close to the end of the Archaic Age, which is the point in history where we first start to have some writing from people like Homer and Herodotus. And most of Greece is small peasant farmers at this point in time. The vast majority of their governments fall to tyranny at one point or another during the Archaic Age. One of the few exceptions was Sparta. And classical Greeks, as they transitioned from the Archaic Age, demonstrated a profound paradigm shift from earlier civilizations, discussing the soul, how we come to know things, which is ontology, and physics even. We've been going through some of Aristotle's classic Greek works, in particular his book, the Nicomachean Ethics, but it's a far cry from like paved paintings or like, you know, the crap that people before them came. They had like pictographs and stuff. Like we see real human thought, which again, I've mentioned it on several times in the last few episodes. And look, do you guys see that? Let's see. Do you see those painted rocks or the stacked rocks? Those were here whenever I got here. Let's go over to them. But it's hard for us to imagine that whole groups of people could think differently. But before we had all the scientific advances that we have today, people were very either tribal, animalistic, they worshipped nature, or they worshipped like individual deities. Most cultures were polytheistic, like the Egyptians, where they had multiple deities. Now, these topics, like the soul, how we come to know things, and physics, are at least a little familiar to most Western ears, but only because our ancestors introduced them, and they became such influential topics because of the implications that they had. And they introduced them during this era. See, here's those stacked rocks I was telling you guys about. And then here's another little pool up here. So in early Athens, which is where we'll focus our attention today, around the 5th century BCE, the 500s BCE, or 600s BCE, Polybius and Aristotle, or not Aristotle, but Polybius and Herodotus begin to write about the different kinds of constitutions that they find in the Greek culture. Which one thing that's cool, as an American, we grow up with the Constitution, right? But before our great nation was what it is, humankind didn't have like an example to base its governments off of. And so we see lots of experimentation with different kinds of rule setting, different ways to distribute power. And Polybius's histories goes through the development of a three-pronged classification of governing systems, which are broken down into monarchy, oligarchy, or aristocracy, and then democracy. And for Greeks, these were on like a scale, basically, where monarchies on one extreme end and then full democracies on the other. And today, we generally think of oligarchy or aristocracy as something that's bad, something that's like a sign of a bad society, a society that doesn't value freedom, American ideals, you know. But that wasn't the case for a lot of the Greeks, actually. It may be because they didn't have any experience with poorly ran oligarchies or aristocracies, but there are a lot of Greeks, like Pindar, who's a Greek poet, that write fondly of the Athenian or aristocracy, or just like the Greek aristocracy in general, wherever they were, and that they were they compared them to like the unruly and unwise mob, which we see James Madison do whenever he's writing our Constitution here in the U.S. At the time, Greeks thought of governments as existing on a scale, sliding from absolute one-man rule to complete popular democracy. Many ancient thinkers pushed the idea that an oligarchic system was a preferred ideal. Now, in Athens, the first Athenian council took its oath in 500 and lasted until Alexander the Great's father, Philip of Macedon, reconquered them in 322. Prior to their democracy, the Athenians had been living with a pretty stable oligarchy for about 140 or 150 years. The way it worked was pretty simple. There were 9 archons that ruled at the top. These guys appointed everybody else. Underneath them, they had a council of 51 men that were chosen by the archons, and these guys administered the rest of the population. Now, just before Athenian democracy's birth, a man named Dracon was swept into power, and his resulting reign is where we get the word draconian from. Now, he does have a mixed reputation. Obviously, draconian is kind of like really overly strict laws, so that would lead us to believe from his name that he was a bad guy. But he did create one of Athens' first uniform legal systems where everybody was treated the same, and like people that were from noble families by blood weren't favored just because of who their parents were, basically. Now, in early 6th century, at its core, the 6th century conundrum developed as a consequence of excessive subprime lending. Oh yeah, so the reason this dude was swept into power was because there was a crisis in Athens, which is very similar to what happened in Rome whenever Tiberius Gracchus and his brother Gaius Gracchus started coming to power and doing like his populist reform stuff. Basically, the Thetes, the working class of Greece, the peasants, had gotten involved in speculation or taking out too much debt. The people who owned all the land and the stuff that you needed to farm were charging a whole lot, and then they would give what we would call today subprime lending. They basically gave loans to people who could not afford to repay them, and they used this to repossess everything, and it eventually basically destabilized the system they had. And what makes it worse is if you defaulted on your loan back then, they didn't just take your house. They sold you and your family to foreign slavers. Ouch. So talk about predatory lending, right? We might have some of that still today, but at least people are not being literally sold into slavery with their families and shipped off to different countries. Where are they? Anyways, so to rectify this, a man named Solon ascends to power in 594, and he becomes legendary in Athens history. Ancient megacorporations, those really powerful families, had taken all the good land. And so whenever Solon comes into power, he implements a policy of seisakatheia. It's a Greek word. I'm sure I butchered the pronunciation, but what it means in English is disburdening. He redistributed the land, and then he took the debts, he canceled those, and he disbarred old debts, and then he protected the olive oil trade for like the small Greek artisans. The word disburdening is a good, it's a good term for it. So throughout history, we saw this in Rome when we were talking about them. We will see it when we talk about France's history eventually, in like pre-revolutionary France in the Ancien regime. But what happens often in human societies is one group of people end up in control of key resources, and they charge the lower classes, the mass of the people, too much for these things, who end up going into debt, and at some point the lower classes literally are under too much of a burden and it crashes the whole society. Now, Solon created a new constitution for Athens, again, one of the earliest uniform law codes, and he divides the Athenians into 4 groups based on their wealth, which tells us a lot. 1, wealth was important back then. 2, Athens was a hierarchical society. And 3, the lowest class of people in his constitution, the Thetes, what we call the working class, people who worked for their income instead of like owning something else or having other people work for them, were about 80% of the people. And they had very few rights in this constitution. Only the top 2 classes, like the ultra wealthy, be like if Bezos and Musk were the only people, only the top 2 classes could qualify for political office. So it'd be like if Bezos and Musk and people at that level were the only people who could be senators or run for the House of Representatives. Talk about conflict of interest, right? He also defined wealth by income instead of heredity. So it's important to remember, before Solon came to power, Athens was an oligarchy, but they were hereditary. The Eupatridae, it's a Greek word, that means the birth elite. Those were the guys who ran everything before Solon came to power. And he kind of equalized it a little bit more. They were really wealthy traders and stuff who had no voice in the Athenian democracy before his power, and now they do. So I guess it's a step forward, right? Now, yet, despite these changes, aristocratic infighting would continue to plague Athens after Solon's reign ends. Pisistratus would launch a coup. His initial one fails, then he gets exiled. Then he launches another successful one, and ultimately establishes a 36-year tyranny in Athens. Now, an impressive sculpture reveres 2 brothers, Harmodius, and Aristogaton, as the tyrant slayers. So popular legend has it that these 2 brothers come in and assassinate Pisistratus's children, I think it was, but the tyrants of Athens at the time. And this is significant because this statue is one of the first archaeological remains we have in Greece that was built to honor men instead of gods. Now, even by the time of Herodotus, these people's actual legacy is quite tarnished, and the general consensus today and even back then was that these brothers worsened the state of affairs by bringing violence into the system. But at the time, they were honored for killing these dudes. So Herodotus says that Thucydides, a later Athenian historian, clears this up. It says that his brothers made things worse by assassinating Hipparchus. Hipparchus was Solon's son. Herodotus says that each time a Spartan would consult with the oracle at Delphi, the priests would beg for liberation. So the other major power block in Greece for most of history is Sparta and Athens. Now, up to this point, Sparta has had a relatively stable monarchy with a single king, and the Spartan king Cleomenthes the First does end up invading and disposing of the Athenian tyrant in 610. This is mentioned in books like Aristotle's Politics, the Histories by Herodotus, and several other ancient sources, which is an interesting way for Athens to finally get its democracy. Athens' democracy was born after a Spartan king invaded them and liberated them from a tyrant. Kind of embarrassing for the world's first democracy. In a way, they were rescued by a king. And this sets up their relationship going into the classical period, the relationship that will be crucial throughout the Peloponnesian Wars and most of the major historical events that we associate with classical era Greece. Takeaway: history's a melting pot. we see all kinds of different cultural experiments, be it from ways to govern and distribute power to new inventions, literally technology. And it's all because, a huge part of it at least, is because people were in different circumstances and they were able to associate with one another. The way they saw government was quite different. Again, pretty much anybody from today would just full stop say that tyranny and oligarchy are basically the same and both bad. The Greeks didn't see it that way. They had several successful tyrants who were basically oligarchs that kind of held up the regular working class's standard of living. And if that was being done, the ancient Greeks didn't necessarily believe that full democracy was the right way to go, which most of us would disagree with today. Obviously, money has always talked. Solon's constitution defined classes based off of their income. And the oligarchs who did come to power before him mostly rose to power because of their economic fortunes and wealth. And yeah, so Shenandoah National Park, we're obviously walking away from the river. We've got to find somewhere to sleep tonight. But that right there is really all I've got for you guys today. So this has been a very cool park, actually. It is one that you have to pay. So it did cost $30 to get inside here, but it is, if you pay the $30 for a single car, you can stay here for up to 7 days. Now, I won't be staying here that long. I've got to get all the way up to Maine, and it's starting to get a lot colder. So I've got to continue traveling pretty hardcore for the rest of this month. Ooh, fly. But this is a wandering author here reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same. Spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. What are you guys doing to inspire, uplift, and empower your community today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part. You can count on me to do mine daily. Until next time, I love y'all.